Welcome back to another Python tutorial. So today we are going to cover how to use the TD Ameritrade Python API library. So this is a library that I have probably dedicated many videos on it, many videos. Just a whole bunch of different stuff. And, it's kind of gotten to that point now where I'm pretty happy with everything. I think for the most part, other than the streaming client, what you would be working with the regular client is going to be pretty much exactly the same. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to dedicate a series to just how to use the library, how to get set up, and all that kind of fun stuff. So we will be walking through, I would say, pretty much all of the endpoints. I might not hit every single one just because some are a little bit more duplicated than others, but you will at least from this series be able to, from start to finish, create your developer account, register an app, use the information from that app to then go and use this library. Now, with that being said, there are a couple requirements in order to use this application. And so probably the biggest one is you do have to have a TD Ameritrade account, or you have to have access to a TD Ameritrade account. Now you can create a developer account without having a TD Ameritrade account, but you will find right away it's pretty much worthless because you have a developer account, but you can't really use the API in any sort of fashion because you don't have an account that is associated with it. So even though you can create a developer account, you will not be able to use the API. So it's very important that you understand before you start any of this process, if you do not have access to a TD Ameritrade account, or you do not personally have a TD Ameritrade account, there's really no point of trying to create a developer account because you will not be able to use the API. Additionally, a lot of people who do have TD Ameritrade think that it, and for no bad reason, but they think that it uses the same functionality that you would see in Thinkorswim. They are not the same. Thinkorswim has its own API, and that is an API that we do not have access to. So it is a private API. You cannot access it as an individual. Now, I have heard rumors that supposedly, if you have enough money with TD Ameritrade, supposedly you can, but I've never been able to validate that. So the next big thing is, if you are thinking that you are going to mimic functionality in Thinkorswim, or you're going to be able to control Thinkorswim using the TD Ameritrade REST API, you are wrong. Unfortunately, you cannot do that. And so they are two distinct APIs. Basically the REST, or the web API, is a completely separate entity from the Thinkorswim API. So two different things. Again, if you are trying to mimic behavior in Thinkorswim using this API, then this is not the API for you. Additionally, this library is built in Python, so you will need Python in order to use this particular library. I think there might be other people out there who have a wrapper basically in other languages. I personally haven't used them. I think I've seen a few before, but this series is assuming that you are going to be using Python. Additionally, it is assuming that you have a relatively decent understanding of Python. So in this series, I will not be going over things about, what is a list, what are things like dictionaries, how to do loops or if statements. I am assuming that going into this, you have some familiarity with Python and that you're relatively comfortable using Python, I would say, on a consistent basis. So if you don't have that foundation, I would recommend that you can watch this, but I wouldn't necessarily say go out there and start using it, because a lot of times the operations that you can do with this particular library will actually impact your account. So it's very important that you understand that. All right. So with that out of the way, let's go through the process of creating a TD developer account. And then from there, we will go and register a new app. Now, if at any point, you get lost, or, you're like, Alex, I can't follow you, I do have resources where this library is stored. So this is stored on GitHub. I will navigate to that later, but there are resources that I have there that will show you, oh, I don't think I have that extension anymore. But there's resources there like PDF files that will walk you through this process. So first things first. Oh yeah. Good old Facebook. Good old Facebook. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to go to TD Ameritrade, and basically it's really developers.tdameritrade.com/APIs. Once you navigate to this page, you will normally be directed here. If you aren't, you should still see your ribbon up here at the top. Now, assuming that you do not have an account, we need to register an account. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to register an account with TD Ameritrade. So a couple things that you obviously got to give them is your name. So they're going to need, they're going to need your first name. They're going to need a username. So we'll just say in this case, username 1234. And as I go along, I will be kind of copying this so that way we can use it down the road. And then you need to provide a email address. So in this case, I can do coding.sigma@gmail.com. And then I need to accept the terms and agreements. And then I need to fill out this wonderful portion, X57F2. And then it's going to create a new account. Oh, my bad. We'll do this 456. 4567. So in this case, I took that username, and that was my bad. So we'll do that. Okay, perfect. So then at this point, you will be sent an email. And as you can see, it's right here. And then you just have to click this link. And then from here, you have to finish the process. And so now you need to put a password here. So in this case, I will say, well, I think it's my password 1234. And so you can see here, nothing super fancy. And by all means, go and copy this wonderful information because it will be deleted the second we go through this. So wonderful stuff. And then from here, you need to, again, just verify some stuff here. You can put in company, you can put in an address, you don't technically have to. And then you can say save and log in as username 1234. And then I make sure to save all that. Okay. And no, you don't need to save it. Okay, and then from here, what I need to do is I need to create a new app because right now I just have an account, but just because I have an account does not mean I have an app. So you will notice that this new little button up here appears and it's called My Apps. And so if you go there, you will see that at this point, there's no apps. So we have to add one. Nice little button right here. If you click this, it will say Add New App. And there's a couple pieces of information that you need to provide. The first one is your app name. So in this case, I will call this my new app, and you can name it whatever you want. And then you need a callback URL. This is also called a redirect URI. This is for the authentication process that we will go through when we basically start up our wonderful app. But whatever you put here, you will have to use this information later. So it's very important that you write this down. If you forget to, you can always access it later, but you do need to remember this information because you need it to go through the authentication process. Luckily for us, we can just use a local host. So a local host basically just refers to your own system. Again, if you want to make it a more specific path, you can just use a / and then you can specify that particular path. So in this case, I will call it my test. And again, you can use whatever redirect URL that you want. I'm assuming probably most people are probably just going to use localhost. Normally, this is if you actually have I would say a real life application where potentially you're going to have users use it and things like that. Then in this case, a localhost URL would not make a lot of sense. And then they do request that you explain, what is the purpose of this application? And we'll say, oh, to make orders and get current quotes. Again, it can be whatever you want. I've literally put in 2 letters and I've never been rejected. So once you do that, make sure you create your app. And then from here, it will now tell you the app has been created. Perfect. So what you can do is you can go to that new app and you will see a couple pieces of information. So the first one is your consumer key. This is a very important piece of information and it will be used for authentication. So you just store that information as well because we will need it. And then you can see some other things about when it was issued, when it expires. And then from here, you can see just different information. So individual product, description, and then again, if you do forget your callback URL, also called your redirect URI, it will be stored here. Additionally, you can edit your app and you can also delete your app. So if you want to delete it, you're no longer using it, then you can delete it if you want. And then you can also edit it too as well. All right. So once you have all this information, you pretty much have everything you need to get started. So for resources and documentations, there's a couple different places you can go. So the first one is actually through the TD Ameritrade website itself. So they do list out all the endpoints that you can use with the standard API. And they also have a streaming API. So the streaming API is basically a framework where you can spin up a session and you can have data flow in. So you don't have to make requests every so often. You basically just, you pick a service, you start that service, and that service will keep going as long as the session is valid and as long as that service is valid. So in some cases, there will be situations where a service will not be valid 24/7. So for example, what's the one? I think it's chart equities. There's certain endpoints where they will stop working after the market has closed. So it's very important to keep in mind that some endpoints the information that you get back will change depending on market times. But this is obviously a very good place to go and explore. Additionally, you can go to the GitHub page that houses this particular repository. So in this case, if you go to github.com, aread1192, TD Ameritrade Python API. This is where I store this particular library for other people to use. So you can use this, you can download it, all that stuff, but we will also go through the process of installing it as well. And then from here, I do have just, a little bit of an overview of, how to use the API, how to install the library, kind of what it's doing, some other resource links. I also do have videos on YouTube, which go over this wonderful API. And then I go through the authentication workflow and what that looks like. So, how to log in, how to do that initial one, and, just going through that process. Additionally, if you go into samples and you go down to resources, you will also see some additional resources related to TD Ameritrade. So for example, I do have a PDF here that will walk you through the process of creating a developer account. So again, if for whatever reason you forget or something like that, I do have some resources here for you if you need to use it. Additionally, I do have some resources related to streaming. That's really not useful unless you're kind of doing more of, I would say, the back-end stuff. And then I also do have some examples as well. So if you want, you can see some of the examples that are up here. And then from here, I do have some examples calling different endpoints. And we'll go through some of these again, maybe not all of them, but for the most part, just getting you up and running. And then I also have one for streaming. And then I also have one for orders. And so we'll go through that as well. And then I think I have responses. So I do have examples of how the data will come back to you. This is mostly at this point related to certain streaming endpoints. So it's not really doing the standard ones, but if you are interested in it, you can see what these responses would look like. And then obviously you can adjust your code as needed. All right. So with that, let's go through the process of getting up and running. So let's just close out Visual Studio Code. We'll start right from the beginning. We'll go here and we'll do Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to open up a new window. Now, you don't have to use Visual Studio Code. I mean, you could use, whatever framework you want. I personally like Visual Studio Code. I think it works the best. I've pretty much have no errors with it. PyCharm, I have had issues with that, well, I haven't personally had issues, but I have had people who I've talked to who have had issues with it. So once you open up Visual Studio Code, you just want to open up a folder to store your files. So you can either use an existing one, or you can create a new one by right-clicking, and then you can also go down to New and then Folder. Now in this case, I already have a folder, so I'm going to do Testing TD. And once I have this open, I already have a file in here. This is just a separate file. I am only storing one piece of information in it, and it is my account number. Obviously, I don't want people to see that. So in this situation, just trust me on that one. However, I will create a couple new files. So I do get asked a lot, just because in previous videos, I have something called a config file, and that config file stores information that I normally keep private when I am making a video. Now, in this case, because I'm going to delete this account the minute I finish these videos, I don't really feel it's necessary to hide it at this point. But normally when I create a config file, it's a very simple Python script. So in this case, you can see right here, it's a .py file, and I'm literally storing just a few variables inside of it. So the first one I'm going to store in here is my consumer key. This sometimes is also called client ID. You'll hear it called many different things, and depending on where you read the documentation, it kind of changes, but I do need that information. And then I also need a redirect URI. So the redirect URI, that is the piece of information that I use to go and handle the authentication process. Additionally, I do have something called a JSON path. I will explain a little bit more about what this does when we actually start the authentication process. So I'm going to say copy path, and in this case, I'm going to call this TD state.json. And just because I'm lazy, I guess it's not really lazy. I guess it's more being particular. I want these all to be /. So that's literally all that's in my config file. That's at a bare minimum what you need in order to kind of get started. There's technically, I would say one more piece of information, but I'll explain that in a second. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to install the TD Ameritrade Python API library. So to do that, it's very simple. It's just pip install TD Ameritrade Python library, or sorry, Python API. And so all I have to do is just copy this. And then if I go down to my terminal, I can do pip install. And then if I do that, you will see that yeah, so, well, this one's more for me, but basically I already have it installed. Oh, actually, you know what? I just realized I'm stupid. I made the library and I can't remember where I put it. No, that one's right. My bad. So that's just using it. I already have it installed on my system. So in my situation, I don't need to do anything special about it. But if I wanted to, I could do pip install. Pip install, and then, oh God, I know what I did wrong. It's just that one. And then if I do it, you'll see it run through it. So basically you just want to see it run through everything. So it will install a couple of requirements. So for example, to use this library, you have to have WebSockets, you got to have request, you have to have URL lib. There's a couple other ones in here as well, but these are more dependents on these ones. And so I put that all in there so you don't have to worry about it. You just have to do pip install TD Ameritrade Python API. Okay, perfect. I just want to make sure I'm not going over too much. So then from here, what we can do is we can import from our config file. We're going to from config, we're going to import. I know I have a consumer key. I know I have a redirect URI, and I know I have a JSON path. Now I also have that other file, Alex. Inside my Alex file, I have my TD account number. So again, it's almost laid out exactly like this. There's just an extra variable in there called TD account. So this is your account number. Technically speaking too, there is no reason you have to have these in a config file. You could have all your variables defined here if you wanted to. Sometimes that's okay. Other times you really should keep those separate. I just do this more for video purposes. However, you can, if you want, have these variables defined in the script that you're running this from. Then from here, we're going to do from td.client import, and then we're going to do TD client. From here, we need to create a new instance of the client. So what we do is when we create this new instance, it will create a new instance of that object that we can then do, that we can then create a session with and do different things like logging in and then starting to make requests. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new instance of that TD client, and we're going to say TD client, and then we're going to have our client ID, consumer ID equal my consumer key, my redirect URI equal my redirect URI, and then my JSON path equal my JSON path variable. That's really at a minimum what you need in order to use the API, because all the other endpoints, you can pass through the TD account information. So really at a bare minimum, this is all you need. And technically speaking, you don't even need this one. So what the JSON path argument does is it stores all the information related to access token, refresh tokens, when that information is going to expire in a JSON file. That JSON file is then read by the TD client object, and it uses that information to determine when it needs to go get a new access token. And it also handles things when making requests, because every request you make usually has to have an access token sent along with it. And so it uses the information in that JSON file to go and make that information. Here is the thing about access token and refresh tokens. If you do a full authentication workflow, you get a refresh token. If you then go and do another full authentication workflow, you invalidate your previous access token. So your access token is good for 90 days, assuming you don't go through the full authentication workflow again. So this will make a little bit more sense when we go through it, but for right now, just keep in mind, it is very easy to invalidate your access token, your refresh token. So that's why I added this in here, was making it where you can have that JSON file wherever you want. You just need to point to it for the particular client object. So then from here, we're going to log in to a new session. So we're going to say TD session equals TD client, and then we're going to do login. And then from here, it technically doesn't really return anything. It returns a Boolean, but what you could do is, if you wanted to, you could use the result of this method to then, determine the natural workflow in the actual client. Now, in this case, what I'm going to do is, I forgot, it's going to be TD client login. So this will just return a Boolean. So let's walk through this process of authentication. Okay, so normally when you go through this process and it's your first time, this is going to pop up. It's going to say, hey, please go to this URL provided for your account and authorize this particular API session. So you only have to do this process every 90 days, again, assuming that you haven't invalidated your refresh token. But all you do is you just hover over the link and then you do Control-click. Visual Studio will pop up and say, do you want to open it? You can just say open. And then from here, you will be prompted to log in. So I'm just going to log in, and then it's going to ask you if you would like to authorize it. You can just say allow. Okay, and then from here, do not close the tab. You want to copy this entire URL that is in your window. So you can just do Control-C, and then I'm going to close this. I'm going to go back into my terminal, and I'm going to do Control-V. So it says paste the full URL redirect here. So do that. Okay, once you've done that, it's going to then create this JSON file. Inside this JSON file is your access token, your refresh token, and when each of those expires. Additionally, there's the authorization URL. So if you wanted to go through that process again, you could. And then there is also the redirect code. So it does store that information. Now it doesn't really use it again, but it does store the information in there in case you ever wanted to look at it visually and say, hey, like, why is this not working right? Or something along that nature. So it is there for you to use, but for the most part, you should never touch it, because if you start touching it and ruining it, it will actually go and make you go through the full authentication workflow. So it doesn't break the library, but it can make the process of using the library a little bit more challenging. Now, to give you an idea of what happens, say I move this into this other folder, right? So let's just say I move it there. And then, look, I moved it, and I'm going to run this again, right? It's going to make me go through the entire authentication workflow again. And if I go through this full authentication workflow again, it will invalidate this refresh token. I'm going to say that again. If I go through that full authentication workflow again, and this refresh token is not expired, it will now be expired because I just went through that full authentication workflow again. So it's very important that you always point to the same JSON file. Now, if you don't pass through this argument, basically the way I wrote the library is it will store it in the location where this library is installed on your system. So for some people, that's fine. You just need to make sure you're looking at the same location. Some people want more flexibility, so this argument allows you to do that, but there's no reason you have to provide it. If you don't provide it, it will store that JSON file in the location in which this library is installed. Very important to remember that. So if I run this again, and it's now in the same location that it expects it's at, it doesn't prompt me to log in again. So that's very important. Now you don't have to worry about the authentication workflow, at least for another 90 days. So in 90 days, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, you're going to have to log in again, and you're going to have to provide your credentials. But it's so far in between, it really shouldn't be that much of a big deal. So now that we have a session that's authorized, let's start working with some endpoints. So let's get current quotes. So I will say quotes response. And actually, I'm going to import another library just so we can make it a little bit easier to read. And that's pretty print. I'm going to do TD client, and then I'm going to do gets, and you can see there's a lot of endpoints. Get quotes. I'm going to do instruments. So instruments is a list of basically ticker symbols. They can also be other symbols as well, so like futures and stuff like that. In this case, if I want Microsoft, and I want Apple, and maybe I want Square. So it's a list of symbols, and that's it. There's nothing else. And then you can print quotes response. And so you can see all the quotes. I realized I didn't do pretty print, so I'm going to do pretty print again. And so you can see all the quotes. So very cool, very useful if you are trying to get real-time quotes and stuff like that. Additionally, if you want, you can get positions and orders for an account. okay, account or accounts. So from here, orders and positions would equal TD client. And then we'll do get accounts. So it's the get accounts endpoint. Now with this one, that's a little bit different. If you want the orders and positions for all of your accounts, because some people, like myself, we have multiple accounts, some are linked to my main account. So if I specify all, it will return positions for all of my accounts along with orders. Then from here, I can do fields, and I can do, this is again a list. It's going to be positions and then orders. Nice thing is, if you look down here, you can see some examples and what everything's supposed to be doing. And then from here, it's going to do all that fun stuff. And then we will do same thing here. We'll do pretty prints, orders, and positions. Bam! So you can see it gives me all my orders and positions that I currently have. They have balances too, so you even get balances if you want them. So very useful information. Again, some people use it in different ways, but you don't technically have to use it like that. And then also the other way is you can just specify just a single account. So if you don't use all, you just need to pass through a single account and it will return that as well. So again, everything still the same. So very cool, right? All right, so that's accounts. Well, sorry, not accounts. It's orders and positions, which just so happens to be under, get accounts. Let's look at another one and then we'll call it quits. Let's look at get transactions. We'll do accounts, and then this one will be TD accounts. So this one's kind of interesting. There's a lot of different arguments you can pass through here. So if I want all the transactions, I can specify the type. So buy only, all. I haven't made any transactions recently, so it's not going to return anything. I can look at ones that match a specific symbol. I can look at a start date or an end date if I want as well. So these are just a couple different ways where if you want to narrow down the type of transactions that you want to see for a particular account, you do have that capability if you'd like. So maybe I want the transaction type. Okay, in this case, I want to do buy, and then I want the symbol for Microsoft. I haven't bought Microsoft though. And then I have a start date. It's very important that the start date is of ISO format, year, month, day. So in this case, I want 2020. I want 0101. And then I want an end date. In this case, I want it to be 2020, 0401. So grab all the transactions that meet a certain criteria. And so we'll say transactions. Bam. And then we'll do pretty print, and then transactions. Probably not going to return anything. Oh, did I put in the wrong one? Buy only. My apologies. Buy only. So that's also another nice thing about this particular endpoint is it will prompt you if you put in the wrong type of argument. So in this case, I don't have any transactions that meet that criteria because I haven't made any. But I think it does highlight a nice fact that it will try to guide you in some cases when it can, that what you're passing through just doesn't make sense. And so you need to pass through an argument that's a valid one. With that, though, I think we have done enough for today. So at this point, if you have any questions about, just using the API, getting started, anything like that, by all means, put them down in the comments below. Feel free to read the documentation. I find it interesting. I find a lot of things interesting that I'm sure a lot of other people don't find interesting, but I find it interesting. It does help. Just be a little bit warned. It's kind of hard to find examples right now on the TD Ameritrade website. I think by far, I provide some of the most detailed documentation at this point, which I think is kind of funny. You'll find that it gets much worse once you start getting to the streaming API, because that is just a mess. Oh, it's a mess. But yeah, so at this point, if you have anything related to kind of just getting up and running, by all means, put them down in the comments below. Just as a little bit of a warning to anybody, I do make changes to this library. Some are more immediate than others. It just kind of depends how much time I have to kind of dedicate to it. But I do try to improve upon it. I would say at this point, the streaming client, there's work to be done here. It's usable, and somebody who has, I would say, a relatively good understanding of Python probably could take this code and get it to work the way they needed it to. But I would say that one, just be ready on that one, where there's going to be more changes. And so things might code where method names might change or properties might change. The standard API, it's relatively static at this point. I very rarely do many changes on it. It's really the streaming API where you're going to kind of see the bulk of the changes. So yeah, thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in video 2.